We begin with breaking news on the last-ditch efforts to avoid a Russian invasion of Ukraine that U.S. officials say could begin at any time. You're looking at President Biden on what could be one of the most consequential phone calls of his presidency, a 62-minute phone conversation with Russian President Vladimir Putin, warning him against sparking a war that could produce widespread human suffering in Europe. But despite the call, a senior administration official tells CNN Russia may attack anyway. There are other worrying signs that the U.S. believes diplomatic efforts could be in vain. The U.S. Secretary of Defense has taken some U.S. forces out of Ukraine, moving them elsewhere in Europe. The State Department has ordered all non-emergency staff to leave the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv, and they are making personal phone calls to other Americans in the country, warning it is past time to get out and no one is coming to rescue you if Ukraine becomes a combat zone. Right now, Russia has Ukraine surrounded on three sides. Look at that map right there. On three sides, the White House says an invasion would likely begin with aerial bombings, missile attacks, and a rapid assault on Kyiv, potentially during the Olympics. CNN is covering every angle of this crisis, as only CNN can. Kylie Atwood is at the State Department. Nick Robertson is in Moscow. But let's begin with the White House and Arlette Saenz and how things are going there. Arlette, what do we know? What more do we know, I guess we should say, about this phone call between the president and Vladimir Putin? This is a very important conversation that just took place.
Yes, this is an incredibly high-stakes conversation between President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin. And a senior administration official says that there was no fundamental change to the dynamic that's been unfolding over the course of the past few weeks, as the likelihood of Russia invading Ukraine appears to be increasing. Now, this official described the conversation as professional and substantive, but said that Russia may move forward with a military attack anyways. The phone call between Biden and Putin lasted just over an hour. The president holding that call, that secure call from his presidential retreat at Camp David. And I want to read you a portion of the White House statement regarding that call. They said that the president warned that there would be severe costs imposed on Russia if it moves forward with an invasion. And the statement also says President Biden reiterated that a further Russian invasion of Ukraine would produce widespread human suffering and diminish Russia's standing. They added President Biden was clear with President Putin that while the United States remains prepared to engage in diplomacy in full coordination with our allies and partners, we are equally prepared for other scenarios. Now, the U.S. and allies have been working on a package of sanctions that would be imposed against Russia if it moves forward with an invasion. They have also committed to providing Ukraine with some defense capabilities to try to protect themselves. We have seen the U.S. Planning and deploying thousands of troops to neighboring Poland over the course of this past week. Those efforts to put military positioning in Eastern European NATO allied countries, really an effort to bolster those NATO allies. The U.S. has made clear that they will not be sending American troops into Ukraine. Of course, the U.S. also trying to protect some American interests in the country, evacuating most of the non-emergency personnel at their U.S. embassy there in Kyiv. Additionally, they've warned that Americans need to leave the country immediately this weekend, as the security situation could continue to devolve in the coming days. So really, the question is, what are these next steps? President Biden has said, or the White House says that in that call, President Biden said that he and his team will remain in contact with Russia over the course of these past few days. Of course, the White House hoping that diplomacy could help lead to de-escalation, but it's unclear whether that might be possible if Putin does decide to move forward with an invasion, which the White House says they do not have full visibility on in his current thinking, and whether he'll make the decision to do that.
All right, Arlette, thanks very much for that. And Nick, what are you hearing from the Kremlin at this point? I suppose more denials, more of the same.
Jim, yeah, I think that kind of sums it up, doesn't it? The diplomatic dial has not shifted here. President Putin's spokesman, or one of his deputy officials in his office, said that the conversation came from a position of hysteria of these accusations that Russia is about to invade Ukraine. And I think the central theme from the President Biden's call with President Putin from the Russian perspective was to reiterate again that they have not had their core issues addressed, which is to deny Ukraine access to NATO and for NATO to go back to 1997 position. So, and we heard that across several phone calls today. President Macron heard a version of that when he spoke to President Putin. Secretary of State Antony Blinken heard a version of that when he spoke with Sergei Lavrov here, the foreign minister. I think the two other threads that came out of today was one, Russia, and this was in the sort of Antony Blinken-Lavrov call and the Putin-Macron call, Russia trying to put pressure on the United States, on France, on Germany, on others, to put pressure on Ukraine to more fully comply, in their view, with the Minsk agreement, to get into those talks with the Russian-backed pro-Russian separatists in the east of Ukraine, which the Ukrainian officials, for many substantial reasons of their own, don't want to get into those conversations. So there was that pressure coming one way from Russia on that. And the other pressure, again, this was from Antony Blinken to Sergei Lavrov, from Macron to Putin, was if you are really serious about having a diplomatic off-ramp and you want to get into that conversation, then de-escalate. Now, that's something we've been hearing a lot of from the US side and from the European side over recent weeks. But really now it does seem to be a test of Russia's intent. Are you really keeping this sort of diplomatic space going just so you can build up forces? I think it seems to be trying to test out the Russian position and just say, look, we think you might be about to invade. If you're not, de-escalate and let's have this conversation. That's the path. Trying to get some kind of commitment there. So when I say the diplomatic dial hasn't moved, it's because Russia's not giving visibility on that at all.
Fascinating. All right, Nick, it is brinkmanship, no question about it at this stage. Kylie, let me go to you. The U.S. has already made clear Americans need to evacuate. They're telling embassy staff to get out as well. But it sounds like there are some Americans there who are just simply refusing to leave.
Yeah, that's right. A senior State Department official reiterated today that Americans should leave, saying that it is past time for them to leave the country, because they warned that these attacks that could be coming from Russia won't be discriminating against anyone. These incoming aerial bombings that are possible, that the United States believes Russia would begin its campaign with, could really hit anyone. And we have heard this multiple times from State Department officials, from Biden administration officials over the last few days. State Department saying that they have been in touch in recent days with thousands of Americans who are still in Ukraine. But as you said, Jim, they said that there are a substantial number of those Americans who don't want to leave the country. They are essentially urging them to change their mind and do so before there could be a war zone. The senior State Department official saying if there's a war zone, that greatly diminishes the Biden administration, the U.S. government's capability to help out any Americans, also making it very clear that they have no plans for a military evacuation to help those Americans who are still in the country. And we should also note that the U.S. Embassy has now drawn down most of its personnel, most of the diplomats leaving the country. A small number are still staying at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv, the capital. A small number are also staying now in a city to the west of to western Ukraine. Obviously, that would be further away from the borders where Russia could, in fact, invade. But it's significant that the State Department made these actions, made this decision before this phone call between the two presidents. But even after that phone call, still saying there is clearly a possibility that Russia moves forward with this invasion.